So while we're being most polite in using the term misinformation, what are we actually saying? We're saying that some companies are promoting a concept or that is overtly misleading, that the biosimilars are somehow less safe, less effective, the nature of their development means they're less reliable than the reference product. Is that right?
So with the Pfizer's citizens petition, those misleading pieces of information are outlined in the citizens petition. But I want to go back to what Carlos said. And we saw this when we launched the first biosimilars in Europe 10 years ago. And the same misinformation was introduced in Europe. And we're seeing that again today in the US. And it's to lower the confidence in the prescribers and the patients in using biosimilars. So we asked, 10 years ago, we asked the EMA to help us with that. And the same programs and actions were taken, but that Carlos outlined were taken by the EMA 10 years ago, where they were the source, and this is key, the FDA, like the EMA, needs to be the primary source of education on biosimilars about their safety and efficacy, and we need to help distribute and disseminate that information. The FDA, like the EMA, needs to combat the misinformation that's out there about biosimilars and send letters to these companies, the reference product companies that are doing this, or other organizations. It's time, we need that here in the US.
So, Kasia, as a physician, as a provider, what have you seen from the clinical side working with patients about this sort of misinformation that's out there? Are you seeing it in day-to-day practice? Do you understand what's being alluded to here by the sponsors?
Thanks, Julian. I think I have a little different perspective on this. I was not so much aware of this misinformation campaign, for the lack of better words. I would use that. But I've done some intensive physician education at 5 national meetings in last 2 months. And I was very unpleasantly surprised to find out so many misconceptions amongst physicians who are the prescribers. I spoke at 3 large GPO meetings and one of the National Oncology Conference. And the first question a lot of physicians asked me was, so what's the difference between a generic and biosimilar? And I said, oh my God. I think where do I start here? Because there's a huge difference between a generic drug and a biosimilar. A generic drug do not have to do trials. They are simply chemical compounds called API. You buy it in a bulk like kilograms or a ton and convert them into the tablets. But because there was a perception that there's not a lot of difference between the generic drug and biosimilar, they say, well, why are they priced so high? And I said, listen, these drugs have to undergo multiple steps that establishes the totality of evidence compared to the reference product. It's not an easy task. It's not an easy solution. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see a huge price drop. You definitely would see some sort of incremental decline in the price, but you don't expect them to behave like generic drugs that happened back in 2004, 5, 6 when the paclitaxel went generic, when carboplatin went generic, when the cisplatin went generic. So there's a lot of misconception. It may not be intentional that they've not learned, but we have to do a lot of additional education at physician level to help them become aware of what biosimilars are as a different class. And the second observation I made was patients were not as much reluctant to accept biosimilars. And I'll share when our discussion points in the direction that patients were least likely to resist adoption of biosimilars. I think the providers, the nurses, the mid-levels, and maybe the payers are the team that we need to work with in educating about biosimilars and what the class of drug is.